A man is chasing a runaway camel across an empty desert, cursing under his breath. He climbs one more dune, expecting only more sand, and instead he sees a city of gold. Its walls are silver, its gates are studded with pearls, and its streets are utterly silent. He fills his pockets with jewels, stumbles home, and tells everyone what he has found. But when they go to search for the shining city, the desert has swallowed it whole. For more than 13 centuries, this was filed away as just another Arabian fairy tale. A lost city of the sands, punished by God, buried forever, impossible to ever find again. I am Brother Idris, and I want to tell you what happened when people stopped laughing. Because in our own lifetime, a team pointed a satellite at that desert and saw something. A buried structure beneath the sand, almost exactly where the legends had always pointed. The headline screamed that the fairy tale was true, that a Quranic city had been found. And yet the real story, as it always is stranger than any headline could hold. What they actually found, and what they did not, is a riddle of myth, greed, and sand. This is the story of a city that may be 3 different cities wearing one borrowed name. It is a story about the Quran, about the pirates of memory, and about a camera in orbit. So stay with me, and let us walk out into the emptiest desert on the whole earth. Bring water, and bring a little patience, because the truth out here is buried very deep. To understand the city, you first have to understand a warning carved into Scripture. In the Quran, there is a short and thunderous chapter that people simply call the Dawn. It points back to a people the early Arabs remembered with a mixture of awe and dread. Long before the Quran, the Arabian poets already sang of the vanished tribe of Ad. Their ruined towns were a kind of national ghost story, whispered around the desert fires. It speaks of Iram of the pillars, the like of which was never built in any land. And it ties that haunting name to an ancient people the Quran calls the Ad. The Ad were remembered as near giants, taller and stronger than any people before them. They lived in a green and blessed corner of southern Arabia, rich beyond easy counting. In that age, the legends say, the south of Arabia was not yet all burning sand. It held gardens, springs, and trees, and the Ad grew mighty upon its abundance. Their bodies were like towers, and they raised great buildings on every commanding height. They raised great monuments and tall pillars on every hill, drunk on their own power. To call something older than the Ad was to say it was lost beyond all memory. They were the ghosts at the edge of the Arabian imagination, half history and half nightmare. And their greatest city carried that same haunting name, Iram of the lofty pillars. It was the proudest thing the proudest of peoples had ever raised against the sky. To such a people, the story goes, God sent a warner, a prophet named Hud. Hud was one of their own, no stranger, but a voice raised from inside their own tribe. That is often the hardest voice of all to hear, the one that knows you too well. He told them to be humble, to worship one God, and to give up their cruelty. They laughed at him, certain that no force on earth could ever bring them low. Who, they asked, could possibly be greater in raw strength than the towering people of Ad? They had confused their wealth with virtue, and their muscle with permanence. It is the oldest mistake in the whole human story, and the most expensive one as well. And so, the Quran says, a punishment came down upon them out of the open sky. A roaring, howling wind rose against them, and it did not stop for 7 long nights. It was a cold and barren wind, the Quran says, stripped of all mercy and all rain. It picked men up and flung them down, and it scoured the green land back to bare bone. For 7 nights and 8 days, the wind tore through everything they had ever built. When it finally fell silent, the people of Ad lay scattered like the hollow trunks of palms. Their cities, their pillars, and their pride were all buried beneath the drifting sand. The Quran offers this not as a treasure map, but as a stark and simple warning. Be humble, it says, for even the mightiest civilization is one storm away from silence. The people who first heard these verses lived among the wind-worn ruins of older worlds. They did not need convincing that nations could die. The desert was full of their bones. That is the buried seed of the whole legend. And notice what the scripture does not give. It gives us a people, a sin, and a fate, but it gives no location and no gold. The word translated as pillars is itself a quiet puzzle that scholars still argue over. Some read it as soaring columns of stone, the marks of a great and settled city. Others read it as the tall tent poles of a proud and wandering desert tribe. So even the famous pillars of Iram may be a translation reaching uncertainly across the centuries. There is no jeweled palace in those verses, and there is no map drawn in the margin. The gold, as we will see, was added much later by human hands and hungry imaginations. A warning is a hard thing to hold on to. A treasure is a much easier thing to chase. And so, generation by generation, the warning was slowly buried beneath the treasure. For now there was only a name and a silence out somewhere in the trackless sand. Now watch closely how a sober warning slowly turned into a glittering treasure story. Storytellers are never content with a moral alone, and the odd were far too good to waste. A bare lesson does not travel well from town to town across the long centuries. But a city of gold guarded by a curse will travel anywhere a human tongue can carry it. Over the centuries, people built a whole shining legend on top of those few Quranic lines. They gave Iram a king, a proud and dazzling tyrant they named Shaddad, son of Ad. Shaddad, they said, had heard the descriptions of paradise, of its gardens and its palaces. And in his arrogance, he decided that he would build a paradise of his very own on earth. If God promised a garden in the next life, Shaddad would simply seize one in this life. He would not wait, and he would not beg. He would build heaven with his own 2 hands. He poured the whole wealth of his empire into a secret city deep in the desert sands. Its walls were raised from bricks of gold and silver, set upon towering columns of stone. Its palaces were studded with rubies and pearls, and its gardens were fed by running water. For many long years, thousands of laborers toiled to build this earthly heaven for their king. And when at last it was finished, Shaddad set out with his court to enter it in triumph. But as he came within sight of its gates, the legend says, the punishment finally fell. A single cry from the sky struck them all dead, every last one of them, in an instant. He never set even 1 foot inside the paradise that had cost him his whole kingdom. He died at the very threshold, the legend says, with the gates of his dream wide open. And Iram, the city built to rival heaven itself, was hidden away from the eyes of men. It did not crumble slowly into ruin. It simply vanished, perfect and empty, into the sand. And here the legend gives us its most famous and completely irresistible scene. Generations later, an ordinary man went wandering in the deep desert after a lost camel. His name, the storytellers say, was Abdullah, and he was no hero, only a herder. It matters that the man who finds the city is a nobody, a poor man chasing an animal. The legend wants you to believe that the desert opens its secrets only by pure accident. Following his stray animal over the dunes, he came upon a city that should not exist. Its gates stood open, its streets were silent, and its palaces glittered with untouched treasure. He walked its empty avenues in terror and in wonder, past pearls as large as eggs. He snatched up whatever jewels he could carry, and he fled back into the living world. He took only what his trembling hands could hold, and even that felt like far too much. For he sensed that the city did not want to be robbed, and did not want to be found. When word of his discovery reached the caliph in Damascus, the ruler summoned him at once. The caliph of the day was a hard and corrupt man, not easily fooled by tall tales. And yet even he could not fully explain away the jewels glittering in the herder's hand. The herder told his impossible story, and he showed the strange jewels as his only proof. The scholars of the court listened, and they nodded, and they said, "This must be lost Iram, the city of Shaddad, the city of the Odd, revealed for one moment and then hidden again." The tale was written down, and it traveled, and it grew richer with every single retelling. In time, it entered the vast and famous collection we now call the 1001 Nights. And so, a stern Quranic warning about pride had fully become a glittering story about gold. The lesson had not vanished, but it now wore a crown and dripped with precious jewels. And once a treasure is given a location, sooner or later, someone will go out to dig. But there was a second great legend loose in Arabia, and this one carried a different name. Far to the south, the wandering Bedouin told of a lost city that they called Ubar. It too had once been fabulously rich, and it too had been destroyed for its wickedness. It is the same shape of story, a rich city drowned for its sins, told twice with two names. It was said to lie out there somewhere in the empty quarter, the great southern sand sea. The empty quarter is the largest continuous body of sand dunes on the entire planet. It is a furnace of dunes the size of small mountains, where almost nothing can survive. To imagine a wealthy city out in that void sounds, on the face of it, completely insane. And yet, the legend of Ubar simply refused to die, passed down for hundreds of years. Notice that this name, Ubar, appears nowhere at all in the verses of the Quran. It belonged to a separate stream of memory, one older and more local than Scripture. The Bedouin did not treat it as a fable for children, but as a piece of buried family history. Here I want you to pause, because the obvious objection is the most important clue of all. Why would anyone ever choose to build a rich city in the deadliest desert on Earth? The answer is a single fragrant word that once quietly ruled the entire ancient economy. That word is frankincense, and to understand Ubar, you first have to understand its strange power. We have almost forgotten frankincense now, but it once moved emperors and quietly shaped borders. In the ancient world, this single perfume was a pillar of the whole economy of the East. Frankincense is a resin, the dried, milky sap that bleeds from a scrubby desert tree. That tree grows well in only a handful of places, and the very finest of it grew here. The dry hills of Dhofar, in what is now southern Oman, were its single richest home. Those same hills still drip with this fragrant resin today, exactly as they did for the pharaohs. For thousands of years, this humble, sticky resin was worth almost its own weight in gold. One Roman writer complained that the trade in it drained his empire of its silver. A single emperor is said to have burned a whole year's harvest at one beloved funeral. It was burned in the temples of Egypt, and carried in the grand funerals of Rome. Emperors craved it, gods were honored with it, and the dead were sent off in its smoke. A whole branch of the ancient world's economy existed simply to move this perfume northward. Camel caravans gathered the precious resin in the south and hauled it across the burning desert. They carried it for many weeks through killing heat toward the rich markets of the Mediterranean. The road they followed became one of the great trade routes of the entire ancient world. Whole kingdoms rose up along it, grown fat on the taxes squeezed from passing incense. And every caravan that dares to cross a desert needs one thing above all else to survive. It needs water, reliable water, at hidden wells spaced carefully across the empty miles. Whoever controlled those wells controlled the trade itself and grew wealthy beyond all measure. Water in that desert was not a mere convenience. It was power and life and a throne. A single dependable spring could turn a patch of nothing into a fortress of gold. A city built upon such a well would not be insane at all. It would be almost inevitable. That is the hard economic engine quietly hiding underneath the shimmering legend of lost Ubar. By the early 20th century, the legend of Ubar had snared the Western explorers. These were men who dreamed of being the first outsider ever to cross the Great Sands. One of them was a quiet Englishman named Bertram Thomas, traveling in the 1930s. As he prepared to cross the empty quarter, his Bedouin guides spoke of a lost place. They told him of a wicked city whose people had angered God and been destroyed. One of them pointed out across the dunes and said, "Look, there is the road to Ubar." Thomas wrote it down, this hint of old tracks leading to a city beneath the sand. He never reached it himself, but he gave the legend a name that would stick forever. He called it the Atlantis of the Sands. And that single phrase set imaginations on fire. You will often hear that famous phrase credited to Lawrence of Arabia himself, but that is a later myth of its own. The words almost certainly belonged to Thomas. A lost desert city, rich and sinful and swallowed whole, waiting silently somewhere out there. Other famous explorers soon caught the same fever and went hunting for the prize. One of them searched for a lost city and instead found great craters burned into the sand. They were not the work of God, but the scars of a meteorite that had once fallen there. They crossed the dunes by camel and by motor car, and they all came back with nothing. The empty quarter is simply too vast, and a buried city is far, far too small. You could pass within a single mile of it and never once know that it was there. For decades, the Atlantis of the Sands remained exactly that, a beautiful, maddening rumor. Brave men gave years of their lives to those dunes and came home with only sunburn. The desert kept its secret the way it keeps everything, by being simply far too large. And then the search was taken up by a man who was not an explorer at all. His name was Nicholas Clapp, and he was an American maker of documentary films. He had read the old books, and the legend of Ubar had quietly taken hold of him. He was not a scholar or a soldier, and at first nobody took his obsession seriously. But sometimes it takes an outsider, free of the old assumptions, to ask a new question. But Clapp had one simple idea that none of the great desert explorers had ever had. If a buried city was impossible to find from the ground, then he would not look from the ground. He would look down instead from far above, from the cold and patient eye of space. Clapp had heard that faint, ancient ruins could sometimes be spotted from high in the air. He went digging in a library and found an old map drawn by the geographer Ptolemy. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Ptolemy had marked a trading place out in this region. Ptolemy had never once set foot in Arabia, and his map was crowded with errors. And yet, buried among those errors, a faint and stubborn memory of the trade survived. It was a faint and ancient clue, but it told Clapp that he was not chasing nothing. So he did something that the camel-riding explorers of old could never have done. He picked up a telephone, and he called the space scientists at NASA. It is one of the strangest phone calls in the entire history of archaeology. A filmmaker chasing an Arabian fairy tale, asking a space agency to help him find it. At a NASA laboratory, researchers turned their instruments toward the southern Arabian desert. They gathered images from orbiting satellites and radar flown high aboard the space shuttle. That radar could sense things the human eye never could, even through a thin skin of sand. The same kind of instrument used to map distant planets was now aimed back at our own. It read the desert like a faded page, lifting up writing that time had tried to erase. And when they carefully processed the images, faint, pale lines began to appear in the dunes. They were the ghosts of old roads, the packed tracks of countless ancient caravans. For thousands of years, heavy camels had slowly worn these paths into the desert floor. The endlessly shifting sands had since hidden them from anyone standing on the ground. But seen from space, the buried highways of a forgotten trade glowed faintly on the screen. And the scientists noticed that these old tracks were not scattered around at random. Like the spokes running into the center of a wheel, they converged on a single point. Roads do not lead to nothing. A road is a question, and its answer waits at the end. And every one of these ancient roads was quietly asking about the very same place. The roads of the entire ancient world were pointing, all together, at one spot in Oman. That spot was a crumbling old waterhole that the local Bedouin called Shisr. It was not a glamorous place at all. It was a muddy well in the middle of nowhere. A small, rough fort already stood at Shisr, and earlier travelers had dismissed it entirely. They had glanced at the rude stone ruin and guessed it was only a few centuries old. But the caravan tracks from space insisted that something far older lay beneath it. The earlier travelers had been right about the rough fort, but they had stopped digging too soon. They had judged the surface and never suspected the deeper city sleeping below it. So in the early 1990s, a real expedition came to dig the well of Shisr. It was led in the field by an experienced and careful archaeologist named Zarins. His spades soon cut through the late fort and down into something much deeper and older. Out of the ground rose the walls and the towers of a fortress thousands of years old. It had once guarded the precious well, the vital gateway for the caravans of incense. For a caravan dying of thirst in that furnace, this one well was the difference between life and death. They unearthed pottery that had been carried there from Greece, from Rome, and from far Persia. These were not the cheap goods of a backwater. They were the marks of a wide and busy world. For a brief time, this lonely well had been wired into half the markets of the planet. This had been no empty rumor at all. It had been a real crossroads of the ancient world. And then they noticed the strangest and most haunting detail of the entire site. A great part of the old fortress had broken away and fallen into a deep hole in the earth. The ground beneath it was hollow limestone, with an underground spring gnawing slowly inside. Over the long centuries, that cavern had collapsed, and the buildings above were swallowed down. The towers had not been blown away by any wind. They had simply dropped into the earth. The very spring that had once given the city its life had also dug its hidden grave. The city devoured by the earth itself, almost exactly as the desert legends had always sworn. stand at the very edge of that pit today, and it is hard not to feel a sudden chill. The old stories had said the city was swallowed, and here, plainly, a city had been swallowed. In the winter of 1992, the news broke loudly across the whole world. The newspapers announced that the fabled lost city of the sands had finally been found. Guided by ancient maps and by sharp eyes in space, explorers had uncovered a buried city. And they were, the reports declared, virtually certain that this was the legendary Ubar itself. The story was simply perfect. Scripture and satellites and treasure all in one desert. It seemed that an ancient fairy tale had at last been proven true by modern science. Television crews flew in, and the word Ubar was suddenly on lips all around the world. For a few heady weeks, it was easily the most famous patch of sand on Earth. For one glorious moment, it looked as if the Atlantis of the sands had truly risen again. But this is an archive, and an archive owes you the difficult second half of the story. So let me be honest with you about what was really found out there, and what was not. There was no city of gold at Shisr, and there were no gleaming walls of silver. There were no streets paved with pearls, and no jeweled palace built by a proud King Shaddad. The pearls and the gold had stayed exactly where they had always lived, inside the story. What the diggers found was a working fortress, a tough little caravan stop in the sand. It was an important place, and a genuinely ancient one, but it was not a wonder of gold. It was infrastructure, the dusty plumbing of a trade route, not a king's private heaven. It was a place of dusty traders and tired camels and water, not a paradise made for a tyrant. And the deeper the scholars looked, the more the simple headline began to fall quietly apart. The very man who had led the excavation came to a careful and surprising conclusion himself. He decided that Ubar had most likely never been a single city at all. In the oldest sources, he argued, the word Ubar named a whole region and its people. On the old Roman map, he pointed out, the name marks a folk, not a single dot of a town. The classical writers spoke of the people of Ubar, never of one single shining capital. It was only much later, in the romances, that Ubar shrank down into one golden town. The grand claim that this was the Iram of the Quran was a modern guess, not a proven fact. In truth, the Holy Book never mentions any place at all by the name of Ubar. And the old tales of Iram and of Ubar may well be two completely separate legends. They were braided together by hopeful searchers who badly wanted them to be the same thing. It is so tempting to make every clue fit into one neat and deeply satisfying answer. But honest history often means pulling apart the very stories we most enjoy believing. Some careful scholars went further and called the whole Golden City essentially a myth. The fort, they said, was modest, a watering stop used by a few families at most. It showed, one wrote, how easily even good scientists can fall into wishful thinking. And the truth is, the site had been seen before, by earlier travelers who shrugged and moved on. Soldiers and oilmen had passed that old fort for years without a single second thought. The true breakthrough was not the digging itself, but learning where exactly to dig. The satellites had not conjured a city from nothing, as the breathless headlines implied. And yet, I do not want you to walk away thinking this was all just an empty mistake. Because strip away the gold and the headlines, and something genuinely remarkable still remains. A real and ancient fortress truly had lain hidden out there, forgotten for many centuries. It truly had grown rich upon a trade that once moved one of the ancient world's great fortunes. It truly had been swallowed, at least in part, by a sinkhole opening beneath its own feet. And it truly was found again, almost exactly where the oldest stories had always pointed. A Roman map, an old man's finger, and a Bedouin song had all aimed at the same patch of sand. When the satellites finally looked, those ancient clues turned out to be pointing at something real. That, to me, is the part worth keeping, long after the gold dissolves back into rumor. A thread of true memory had survived 2,000 years of retelling and exaggeration. The legend was never a literal photograph, but it was not a simple lie either. It was a memory, worn smooth and gilded by long time, of a real place that really vanished. The gilding is not a flaw in the memory. It is the wrapping that kept the memory safe. People guard most fiercely what dazzles them, and so the gold, in a way, preserved the truth. And the way that the real city actually died is, to me, the quietest lesson of all. There was no single cry from heaven, and no special wind sent to punish the wicked. The great frankincense trade simply faded away, slowly, across a few long centuries. When the Roman world turned to Christianity, it burned far less incense than it once had. The new faith did not need rivers of smoke to honor its God, as the old temples had. And quietly, on the far side of the world, a whole desert economy began to starve. The caravans thinned, the hidden wells were used less, and the patient desert began to win. The very water that had fed the city's life also ate away at the soft rock beneath it. And one ordinary day, with no prophet anywhere watching, the hollow ground simply gave way. That is how most lost cities truly die, not in sudden fire, but in slow forgetting. A road goes quiet, a well is abandoned, a name slips out of the living languages. And then, one ordinary year, there is simply no one left who remembers it was ever there. The legend needed a thunderbolt, because a thunderbolt is far easier to remember than neglect. But the real truth is that whole worlds can vanish simply because we stop needing them. That is a far more unsettling idea than any wind sent down to punish the proud. It means a city does not need to sin in order to die. It only needs to be forgotten. So what do we keep from the story of Iram, of Ubar, of the city in the sand? I think this tale is really about the strange honesty hidden deep inside our oldest legends. We are always tempted to split the world cleanly into hard fact and pure fantasy. But a legend is rarely ever only one or the other. It is usually a fact that has been dreaming. The job of the archive is not to wake the dream up and simply call it a liar. It is to gently follow the dream back down to the small, true thing that first started it. The people of Arabia never owned a satellite, and yet they somehow kept the location alive. They remembered, in their stories of gold and sin, that something real had been lost out there. And they passed that fragile memory down, hand to hand, across more than 1,000 years. No library held it, no government preserved it, and no stone inscription carried it forward. It survived only because people kept telling each other a story they could not quite forget. Until at last, a machine high in the sky could confirm the stubborn heart of their tale. That is exactly why I love these ruins, the false ones and the true ones alike. Because even our wildest myths are so often just history calling out to us across the dark. So listen closely to the old stories, even the ones that sound completely impossible. Somewhere inside them, More often than you would ever guess, a real buried city is waiting. Not always made of gold, and rarely cursed by heaven, but real and patient and lost. I am Brother Idris, and the archive remains open.